Imagine standing on a hill overlooking the ancient world. In front of you is a city built on rugged hills, surrounded by dry valleys and rocky ground. It has no great river running through it. It is not the largest city in the region. It is not the wealthiest. It is not the capital of some vast empire. And yet, thousands of years later, people all over the world still know its name. Kings fought for it. Armies destroyed it. Prophets wept over it. Pilgrims traveled for days just to see it. Jesus walked through its streets, and some of the most important events in the Bible happened within its walls. That city was Jerusalem. But here is the question: why Jerusalem? Why did this particular city become so important? Why did David choose it as his capital? Why did Solomon build the temple there? Why did the prophets keep returning to it? Why did Jesus deliberately travel toward it, knowing exactly what awaited him? And why, after Jerusalem was destroyed more than once, did its importance somehow become even greater? The answer is not simply geography, and it is not simply politics, because Jerusalem's story is ultimately about something much bigger than a city. It is about the presence of God, the promises of God, and the unfolding story of redemption. And once you understand how Jerusalem became what it was, some of the most familiar passages in the Bible begin to look very different. But there is something surprising about the beginning of this story. Jerusalem was already ancient before David ever made it the capital of Israel, long before the crowds gathered around Jesus, long before Solomon's temple rose above the city, long before Roman soldiers occupied its streets. Jerusalem was already standing among the hills of the ancient land of Canaan. The city appears in ancient sources under names connected with Jerusalem, and in the Old Testament we encounter it in the days of Abraham, as well as in the stories surrounding Israel's conquest of the land. One of its ancient names was associated with the Jebusites, the people who occupied the city before David captured it. This means something important. Jerusalem did not begin as Israel's capital. David did not build the city from nothing. He inherited a city with a long history. And that makes David's decision even more interesting. Because when David became king, he already had other possibilities. So why choose Jerusalem? To understand that decision, we need to picture the geography. Jerusalem sits in the hill country of Judah. The terrain is rugged. The land rises and falls. Deep valleys surround parts of the ancient city. And one feature was absolutely essential to survival: water. The ancient city developed around a reliable water source associated with the Gihon Spring. That mattered enormously in a region where water could determine whether a settlement survived. The city's elevated position also offered defensive advantages. From the surrounding hills, movement through the region could be observed. The valleys created natural obstacles, and the location connected different parts of the land. But geography alone does not explain why Jerusalem would eventually become the heart of Israel. There were other cities. There were older cities. There were cities with their own strategic advantages. So David's choice was not simply, "This is a convenient place for a capital." Something more was happening. David had become king over Israel, but the kingdom itself was not simply a collection of villages. There were different tribes, different regional identities, different political interests, and David needed a capital that could help unite them. Jerusalem offered an unusual possibility. It was not previously the established capital of one of the major northern tribes. By taking Jerusalem and establishing his royal center there, David could create a new political center for the United Kingdom. The city would become known as the City of David. And from that moment, Jerusalem began to change. It was no longer merely an ancient hilltop settlement. It was becoming the center of a kingdom. But David was not finished, because David wanted Jerusalem to be more than the place where the king lived. He wanted it to become the place where God's presence was symbolically centered among his people. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. For generations, the Ark of the Covenant had been associated with the worship and presence of God among Israel. The Ark was not a magical object. It was not God himself. But within the biblical story, it represented God's covenant relationship with his people and was associated with his presence among them. And David wanted the Ark brought to Jerusalem. Imagine what that meant. The political capital was becoming the spiritual center. The king's city was becoming the city associated with the presence of God. And suddenly, Jerusalem was no longer important simply because David lived there. Its significance was being tied to something much deeper. The city was becoming part of the story of God's covenant with Israel, but David had a dream that he would not be allowed to complete. He wanted to build a permanent house for God, a temple, a place where worship would be centered, a place connected with sacrifice, prayer, priesthood, and the covenant life of Israel. But David would not be the one to build it. His son Solomon would. And what Solomon built would completely transform Jerusalem. When Solomon became king, he began construction of the temple. This was not simply another impressive ancient building. Within Israel's biblical theology, the temple represented the place where God's name had been established among his people. It became the center of Israel's sacrificial worship. Priests served there. Offerings were brought there. The great festivals drew worshipers toward Jerusalem, and the city itself became increasingly inseparable from the temple. Jerusalem was now connected to three things that would define its identity for centuries: the king, the temple, and the covenant. And this is one of the most important things to understand about biblical Jerusalem. The Bible does not treat the city as sacred because the stones themselves possess some supernatural power. Its significance comes from what God chose to do there. The city becomes important because it becomes part of God's story. That distinction matters, because Jerusalem's importance will survive even when its buildings do not. Under Solomon, Jerusalem became a center of wealth, administration, worship, and international attention. Visitors came. Foreign rulers heard about Solomon's kingdom. The city became associated with wisdom, kingship, worship, and the temple. But the biblical story refuses to let us believe that prosperity automatically means faithfulness. And this is where the story begins to become uncomfortable, because the city that was supposed to represent God's covenant would eventually become a city deeply marked by human failure. The kings would fail. The people would fail. Idolatry would spread. Injustice would appear. And the prophets would begin warning Jerusalem again and again. They would tell the people that having the temple in their city did not give them permission to live however they wanted. The presence of the temple did not make disobedience acceptable. The city could not save the people from the consequences of rebellion, and eventually the warnings would become reality. But before we get there, there is a fascinating tension in the biblical story. Jerusalem is becoming the city of God's name. Yet Jerusalem is also a city filled with ordinary people. People bought and sold goods. Families lived there. Children grew up there. Workers built walls and houses. Farmers brought produce. Pilgrims entered the city for festivals. Kings made political decisions. Priests served in the temple. And prophets walked through the same streets warning that something was terribly wrong. This is important because sometimes we imagine biblical Jerusalem as if it were simply a religious symbol floating outside history. It wasn't. It was a real city. With dust in its streets, with crowded markets, with stone walls, with homes pressed against one another, with hills rising around it, with people who had hopes, fears, ambitions, and failures, and God chose to work through this very human place. Eventually, the kingdom divided. After Solomon's reign, the united monarchy fractured into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Jerusalem remained the capital of Judah. The temple remained there, and the city's importance continued. But now the biblical story becomes increasingly turbulent. Kings rose and fell. Some sought the Lord, others turned toward idols. Some attempted reforms. Others led the people deeper into rebellion. And the prophets kept speaking. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, and others. Their message was not simply, "Jerusalem will always be safe because God chose it." Their message was much more serious. God's covenant meant accountability. The city could not hide the nation's sin. The temple could not become a substitute for obedience. and Jerusalem's walls could not protect a people determined to ignore God's commands. Then the unthinkable happened. The empire of Babylon came against Judah, and Jerusalem was no longer simply a city facing political uncertainty. It was facing destruction. Imagine Jerusalem during the final days before its fall. The city is under siege. Food is becoming scarce. Fear spreads through the population. The walls that once represented security now surround a city trapped inside itself, and somewhere within those walls stands the temple, the center of worship, the place associated with the presence of God, the symbol of the nation's covenant. Yet the enemy is approaching. The prophets had warned. Now the warnings were becoming history. In 586 BC, Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. The temple was burned. The city was devastated, and many of its people were carried into exile. Think about what that meant. Jerusalem had become the city of the temple, the city of David, the city of kings, the place where generations of Israelites had come to worship, sacrifice, celebrate, and remember the promises of God. But there was a problem. The city was not immune to judgment, and the Bible makes this painfully clear. The same Jerusalem that had become associated with God's name would one day be surrounded by an army. Its walls would be breached, its buildings would burn, and the temple itself would be destroyed. For the people who lived through it, this was not simply the fall of a city. It felt like the end of the world they knew, because if Jerusalem was the city of David, if the temple was the place where God's name had been established, if God had promised his people his presence, how could Jerusalem possibly fall? That question is essential to understanding why Jerusalem became so important. Because the story of Jerusalem is not a story of a city that was always victorious. It is a story of a city that was lost, mourned, rebuilt, and remembered. And what happened after its destruction would give Jerusalem an importance that went far beyond its physical walls. For generations, the prophets of Israel had warned that Jerusalem could not rely on the temple while the people themselves turned away from God. The message was uncomfortable. The temple was not a magical shield. Jerusalem was not protected simply because it was Jerusalem. God's presence did not mean that rebellion had no consequences. Prophets such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others repeatedly called the people back to faithfulness, and eventually the warnings became reality. The great empire of Babylon rose to power. Jerusalem came under pressure. The kingdom of Judah was weakened. And in the early 6th century BC, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar attacked Jerusalem. The city was captured. The temple was destroyed. The treasures were taken. And many of the people were carried away into exile. Try to imagine what that meant. For someone standing in Jerusalem after the destruction, this was not simply a political defeat. The familiar streets were damaged, homes had been destroyed, the walls had been broken, and the place where generations had worshipped God was now a ruin. The Temple of Solomon was gone, the city of David was devastated, and the people were scattered. For a nation whose identity was deeply connected to Jerusalem, this must have raised an almost unbearable question. Had God abandoned them? But the biblical prophets had already given an answer. The destruction of Jerusalem was not presented as proof that God had failed. It was presented as judgment. And yet, judgment would not be the final word. That distinction becomes extremely important, because Jerusalem's story was about to enter one of its darkest chapters, and somehow that darkness would make the city even more significant. Imagine being one of the people taken into exile. Jerusalem is no longer where you live. The temple is gone. The familiar hills are far away. The songs of worship have become memories. And now you are living in a foreign empire. This is where one of the most fascinating things about Jerusalem begins to appear. The city becomes important even when the people are no longer there. Jerusalem becomes a memory, a symbol, a direction, a hope. The Psalms preserve the emotional power of this longing. Psalm 137 famously remembers exiles mourning by the rivers of Babylon and remembering Jerusalem. The city had been destroyed, but it had not disappeared from their hearts. In fact, something almost paradoxical happened. The farther away they were from Jerusalem, the more Jerusalem represented home. It represented the land, the covenant, the temple, the promises of God, the history of their people, and the hope that one day they would return. But there was something else happening. The prophets began to speak about Jerusalem not merely as a ruined city, but as a city that would one day be restored. Isaiah spoke about Zion and Jerusalem in language of hope. Jeremiah spoke about restoration. Other prophetic passages looked beyond the immediate disaster toward a future in which God's purposes would not be defeated. The city had fallen, but the story was not over. There is an especially interesting detail in the biblical account of Daniel. Even while living far away from Jerusalem, Daniel continued to orient his prayers toward the city. In Daniel chapter 6, when the decree of the king made prayer dangerous, Daniel continued his regular practice. He opened his windows toward Jerusalem. Think about that image. Jerusalem was hundreds of miles away. Its temple had already been destroyed. The city had been conquered. And yet Daniel still turned toward it. Why? Because Jerusalem was more than a location on a map. It represented the place toward which God's promises were directed. The ruined city still carried meaning. And this gives us another clue. Jerusalem's importance was not based simply on military power. If it were, its destruction would have ended its significance. But it didn't. The city could lose its walls and still remain central to the story. It could lose its political independence and still remain a symbol of hope. It could lose its temple and still remain connected to God's promises. And eventually, the people would return. The Babylonian Empire did not last forever. Another empire rose, Persia, and the Persian king Cyrus allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their lands. For the people of Judah, this meant something extraordinary. After decades of exile, Jerusalem could be rebuilt. The return was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of another chapter. The foundations of the temple were laid. The people rebuilt. There were setbacks. There was opposition. There were disagreements and discouragement. But eventually, the second temple stood in Jerusalem. The city was alive again. The walls would later be rebuilt and strengthened, particularly in the days of Nehemiah. And once again, Jerusalem became a center of Jewish worship and identity. But something had changed. This was not simply Solomon's Jerusalem returning exactly as it had been. The world around the city had changed. Empires came and went. Persia ruled. Then Greek influence spread. Alexander the Great conquered vast territories. After his death, his empire fractured. Jewish life in Judea was caught in the middle of these enormous political changes. And Jerusalem remained there. A small city at the center of a much larger world. This is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Jerusalem's physical size was relatively small, but its symbolic value was enormous. Whoever controlled Jerusalem was not simply controlling another town. They were controlling a city connected to the temple, Jewish identity, pilgrimage, worship, and memory, and different rulers understood that. Eventually, Jerusalem came under Roman influence, and then one of the most important rulers in the city's later history appeared, Herod the Great. Herod was a complicated figure. He was a builder on an enormous scale. He was also ruthless. But whatever we think of him personally, one thing is undeniable. Herod transformed Jerusalem. By the time of Jesus, Jerusalem was no longer the modest city it had once been. Herod expanded and beautified the temple complex on an extraordinary scale. The Temple Mount was enlarged, massive retaining walls were constructed, courtyards, gates, and monumental structures transformed the appearance of the city. The result was breathtaking. Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem would have seen a city dominated by the temple. Its pale stone would catch the sunlight. The temple complex would rise above the surrounding buildings. Thousands of people could gather there, and during major festivals, the population could swell dramatically. Jerusalem had become a city of pilgrimage. People traveled long distances to celebrate the great festivals. Families came. Priests served. Sacrifices were offered. Songs were sung. The streets filled with people. And this is the Jerusalem that Jesus knew. Not the quiet village that modern people might imagine when they hear the word Jerusalem. This was a crowded, politically sensitive, religiously charged city, and Rome was watching. The Roman authorities knew that large gatherings in Jerusalem could become dangerous. Messianic expectations were strong, national hopes were strong, religious disagreements were intense, and the temple stood at the center of everything. Now imagine entering this city in the 1st century. You pass through crowded streets, you hear different languages, you see pilgrims from different regions, you see Roman soldiers, you see priests, you see merchants, and above the city rises the temple. This is the world into which Jesus enters, and this is where the story of Jerusalem becomes inseparable from the story of Christianity. Jesus did not spend his entire ministry in Jerusalem. Much of his ministry took place in Galilee and other regions, but the Gospels repeatedly show him traveling toward Jerusalem. And there is something striking about the way the Gospel writers describe this movement. Jesus knows what awaits him there. He knows that opposition is growing. He knows that the religious authorities are increasingly hostile. He knows that his journey toward Jerusalem is not simply another trip. It is moving toward a confrontation. And yet, he goes. This is one of the most important questions in the entire story. Why? Why go to Jerusalem? Why not stay in Galilee? Why walk directly toward the place where the danger is greatest? The answer is connected to everything we have seen so far. Jerusalem was the city of David. It was the city of the temple. It was the city where the scriptures had placed enormous expectations. And Jesus' mission was now moving toward a moment when those expectations would be confronted, fulfilled, and transformed. But before we get there, we need to understand what Jerusalem looked like in his day, because the city Jesus entered was unlike the Jerusalem that David had conquered centuries earlier. It had been rebuilt, expanded, decorated, politically controlled, and filled with expectation. Imagine standing near the temple during the 1st century. The scale would have been difficult to miss. Massive stones, large courtyards, priests moving through the complex, pilgrims gathering, animals being brought for sacrifice, money changing hands, people praying, the sounds of thousands of people filling the space. This was not simply a beautiful building. It represented centuries of biblical history. The tabernacle, David, Solomon, the destruction, the exile, the return, the rebuilding. Now the temple stood again, and Jesus would walk into this environment and make statements and perform actions that would force people to ask a question. Who does he think he is? That question is going to become central, because Jesus does not treat Jerusalem as a tourist. He does not treat the temple as an ordinary building. He speaks and acts with an authority that creates conflict, and eventually he will enter the city in a way that will cause crowds to celebrate him. But the same city that welcomes him will soon become the place where he is condemned. And that brings us to one of the greatest ironies in Jerusalem's entire history. The city that represented God's presence would become the setting for the death of Jesus, the temple that stood. By the 1st century, Jerusalem had already survived destruction, exile, rebuilding, foreign rule, and political upheaval. The city had changed, the walls had changed, the temple had changed, the rulers had changed, but the significance of Jerusalem had not disappeared. In fact, by the time Jesus of Nazareth began his public ministry, Jerusalem had become more important than ever. It was the religious center of Jewish life. Pilgrims came from across the land and from communities scattered throughout the Roman world. The great festivals filled the city with people. The temple dominated the landscape. And above all of this stood an expectation that had been growing for generations. When would God fulfill his promises to his people? When would the Messiah come? When would Israel be restored? When would God's kingdom be revealed? And then Jesus began moving toward Jerusalem. At first, this might seem completely ordinary. Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Jerusalem was the center of Jewish worship. Of course, he would visit the city. But the Gospels make something very clear. Jesus did not simply happen to arrive in Jerusalem. He deliberately went there, and he knew what would happen when he did. Throughout his ministry, Jesus teaches in towns and villages across Galilee and Judea. He heals. He teaches. He confronts religious leaders. He gathers disciples. He announces the kingdom of God. But as his ministry progresses, the direction of the story becomes increasingly clear. Jesus begins speaking about Jerusalem, and what he says is astonishing. He tells his disciples that he must go there, and he warns them that suffering awaits him. He will be rejected, he will be killed, and he will rise again. Think about that for a moment. If Jerusalem were simply another city, there would be no reason for the gospel writers to emphasize this movement toward it so strongly. But Jesus knows that his mission is moving toward a specific place, toward a specific city, toward a specific moment. And that creates one of the biggest questions in the entire story. Why go there if he already knows what will happen? Why not stay in Galilee? Why not avoid the authorities? Why not continue teaching somewhere safer? Because according to the gospel story, the cross is not an accident that interrupts Jesus' mission. It is where his mission is heading. And that makes Jerusalem different from every other city Jesus visited. Then comes the journey that Christians know as the triumphal entry. Jesus approaches Jerusalem. The city is filled with pilgrims. The atmosphere is charged with expectation. And Jesus enters in a way that immediately raises messianic associations. The gospel accounts describe him riding into the city while crowds respond with words of praise. Branches are associated with the scene. People speak of the coming kingdom. The atmosphere is not that of an ordinary arrival. Something is happening. But notice the irony. Jesus enters Jerusalem as the promised king. Yet he does not arrive with an army. He does not ride at the head of soldiers. He does not seize the palace. He does not overthrow Rome. His kingdom will look very different from the political expectations of many people around him. And this is one of the most important tensions in the story. Jerusalem expected power. Jesus revealed a kingdom centered on sacrifice. Now imagine the city during Passover. Jerusalem is crowded. Pilgrims have come from distant places. The temple is active. Sacrifices are being offered. Prayers are being spoken. The streets are filled. And into this environment, Jesus enters the temple. What he does there shocks the people around him. He confronts the activity taking place in the temple courts. He overturns tables. He drives out those buying and selling. And he speaks about his Father's house. This moment matters because Jesus is not merely criticizing bad behavior. He is making a statement about the meaning of the temple itself. The temple was the center of Israel's worship. It was associated with sacrifice, with priesthood, with God's covenant, with the story that began centuries earlier with David and Solomon. And now, Jesus is standing in that very place. But he begins to speak and act in a way that points beyond the building. This raises another question. If the temple was the place associated with God's presence among his people, what happens if Jesus himself is claiming an authority that belongs to the one worshipped in that temple? The Gospels repeatedly present Jesus saying and doing things that force his listeners to answer that question. He forgives sins. He claims authority over the Sabbath. He speaks with unusual authority. He calls God his Father in a unique way. And in Jerusalem, these claims become increasingly difficult for the religious authorities to ignore. The conflict intensifies. The city that had once been chosen as the place where God's name would dwell is now becoming the place where Jesus' identity will be confronted most directly. And then the story moves toward the final meal. Jesus gathers with his disciples. They eat together. He speaks about his body. He speaks about his blood. He speaks about the covenant. And the shadow of what is coming becomes unmistakable. The next hours will change everything. Jesus is arrested. His disciples scatter. He is questioned. He is brought before authorities. And eventually he is led out to be crucified. All of this happens in and around Jerusalem. The city that once represented the glory of Israel's kingdom now becomes the setting for what Christians understand as the central event of the gospel, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. There is something deeply significant about the location. The biblical story had been moving toward this moment for centuries. Jerusalem had been the city of David, the city of Solomon, the city of the temple, the city of the prophets, and now it becomes the city of the cross. But Christianity does not understand the cross as simply the tragic execution of a Jewish teacher by Roman authorities. The New Testament presents it as the decisive act through which Christ gives himself for sinners. And this is where Jerusalem's meaning becomes inseparable from Christian faith. The city is important not because the ground itself possesses saving power. It is important because Jesus died there. The stones do not save. The city does not save. The temple does not save. Christ saves. And yet the historical place matters because the gospel is rooted in real events that took place in a real world. Jesus was not crucified in a mythical kingdom. He was crucified under Roman authority in first-century Judea during a period of enormous religious and political tension. Jerusalem was the setting. The cross was the event. And the story still was not finished. After Jesus died, his body was placed in a tomb. The disciples were devastated. The hopes they had attached to Jesus appeared to have collapsed. The one they believed to be the Messiah was dead. And Jerusalem, which had been the destination of his final journey, now seemed to be the place where everything had ended. But early on the first day of the week, the story changed. The tomb was found empty. Jesus had risen. And this is where Jerusalem becomes even more extraordinary, because the same city associated with his death becomes the place from which the proclamation of his resurrection begins. The Christian message is not, Jesus almost succeeded. It is, he is risen. And that changes the meaning of everything that happened before it. The cross is no longer the final scene. The tomb is not the end. Death does not have the final word. The risen Jesus appears to his followers. He teaches them, he explains the scriptures, and eventually he gives them a mission. They are to be his witnesses. And where are they told to begin? Jerusalem. That detail is easy to overlook. The city where Jesus was rejected becomes the starting point for the proclamation of his resurrection. The place associated with his death becomes the birthplace of the church's public witness. And soon, something extraordinary happens. Jerusalem fills with pilgrims again. But this time, the message being proclaimed in the city is not simply about the temple, it is about Jesus. The book of Acts opens in Jerusalem. The disciples are there. Jesus has ascended. And they wait. Then comes Pentecost. The Holy Spirit comes upon the disciples. People from many different regions hear the message. Languages are heard. Crowds gather. And Peter stands before them. Jerusalem had already survived conquest. It had survived destruction. It had survived exile. It had been rebuilt. And now, in the first century, it was about to become the setting for the most important events in the Christian story. But there was something the people of Jerusalem could not yet see. The city they knew was about to become the stage for an event that would change its meaning forever. Because Jesus was going to Jerusalem. And he knew exactly what awaited him there. By the time Jesus approached Jerusalem during the final week of his earthly ministry, the city would have been crowded with pilgrims. Passover was approaching. People had traveled from different regions to celebrate the feast. The streets were busy. The temple was filled with activity. Roman authorities were alert, and expectations were high. This was the setting in which Jesus entered the city, and the gospel accounts deliberately present this moment as significant. Jesus does not simply arrive unnoticed. He enters in a way that evokes the imagery of Israel's scriptures. Crowds gather. People praise God. The atmosphere becomes charged with expectation. And some begin to connect Jesus with the hope of the coming kingdom. But there is a fascinating tension here. The people may have expected a Messiah who would bring political liberation. Jesus was coming to accomplish something much deeper. He was not entering Jerusalem to take Caesar's throne. He was entering Jerusalem to go to the cross. And this is where the meaning of Jerusalem begins to change. For centuries, the city had been associated with kingship. Now the true king would enter it, not riding as a conquering military ruler, but moving toward suffering. After entering Jerusalem, Jesus goes to the temple. And what he does there is one of the most striking moments in the gospel accounts. He confronts the commercial activity taking place within the temple complex. He overturns tables. He challenges the way the temple is being used. And his actions are not random. He is making a prophetic statement. The temple was supposed to be a house of prayer, a place where people encountered God in worship. But Jesus sees something profoundly wrong with what is happening, and his actions reveal something important about his relationship to Jerusalem. He isn't simply criticizing a marketplace. He is confronting a system that had become deeply entangled with religious corruption and injustice. And once again, the temple becomes the center of the story. Remember where this began. David brought the ark to Jerusalem. Solomon built the temple. The city became associated with God's name. The temple was destroyed. The people returned. The temple was rebuilt. Herod expanded it. And now Jesus stands inside it. But Jesus is about to say something even more radical. He speaks about the destruction of the temple. He predicts that the magnificent structure will not remain standing forever. For people who had grown up seeing the temple as the heart of their world, this would have been an astonishing statement. How could the temple fall again? How could Jerusalem lose this magnificent building? And yet, within one generation, it would happen. Jesus' final days in Jerusalem become increasingly tense. The authorities are watching him. His popularity with the crowds is dangerous. His teaching challenges established assumptions. His actions in the temple have intensified the conflict, and Jesus knows that his time is approaching. He shares a final meal with his disciples. He prays, he is arrested, and eventually he is brought before authorities. The city that had once celebrated kings now becomes the setting for the condemnation of Jesus. And this is where Christians see the deepest meaning of Jerusalem, because the cross was not an accident. According to the New Testament, Jesus' death was part of God's redemptive purpose. The city that had been built around the temple now witnessed the sacrifice of Christ. The place associated with sacrifice for generations became the place where Jesus gave himself. This does not mean Jesus' death was simply another temple sacrifice. The New Testament presents his death as something far greater. The sacrificial system had pointed toward realities that Christians understand to be fulfilled in Christ, and Jerusalem became the place where that fulfillment unfolded. Imagine the city during those hours. The streets are filled with pilgrims, the temple is still active, Roman soldiers are present, and outside the city, Jesus is being crucified. For his followers, this must have looked like complete defeat. The man they believed was the Messiah was dead. The one they had followed was gone. The hopes they had placed in him seemed to have collapsed. And once again, Jerusalem appears to have become the city of disappointment. But then something happened that changed the entire story. The tomb was empty. Jesus had risen. And suddenly, the city that had witnessed his death became the city from which the message of his resurrection began to spread. That is the turning point. Jerusalem was no longer simply the place where Jesus died. It became the place where the resurrection was proclaimed. The resurrection is not presented in the New Testament as a minor event at the end of Jesus' story. It is the foundation of Christian proclamation. Jesus had been crucified, Jesus had been buried, and Jesus had risen. His disciples became witnesses. And where were many of those first witnesses? Jerusalem. The same city that had seen Jesus condemned became the city where his followers began proclaiming that he was alive. And this creates another remarkable reversal. Jerusalem had once been the place from which Israel's worship centered around the temple. Now, Jerusalem became the starting point from which the message of the risen Christ would travel beyond Israel. The city was about to become the launch point for a movement that would spread across the Roman world. After his resurrection, Jesus instructed his disciples to remain in Jerusalem. Then came Pentecost. The book of Acts describes the disciples gathered together when the Holy Spirit came upon them. Peter preached. People from different regions heard the message, and thousands responded. Think about the significance of the location. People had traveled to Jerusalem because of the Jewish festival. They came expecting to participate in worship. Instead, they encountered a proclamation about Jesus. And the message was not intended to remain in Jerusalem. The disciples were told to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and ultimately to the ends of the earth. This gives Jerusalem another role. It had been the city of David, the city of Solomon, the city of the temple, the city of the prophets, the city where Jesus was crucified. Now it became the starting point of the Christian mission. And that is one reason Jerusalem is so central to the New Testament. The gospel does not simply happen there. It begins there and moves outward. The book of Acts tells the story of this expansion. The message moves beyond Jerusalem, into Judea, into Samaria, and eventually into the wider Roman world. Paul travels through cities across the Mediterranean. Christian communities appear in places far from Jerusalem. The gospel crosses cultural and geographical boundaries, and suddenly a new question appears. If Christianity was spreading far beyond Jerusalem, why did Jerusalem remain important? Because the city continued to represent the historical center of the events surrounding Jesus. The apostles had been there. The resurrection had been proclaimed there. Pentecost had happened there. The earliest Christian community had formed there. Jerusalem remained connected to the origins of the Christian movement. But history was about to repeat itself. The city would once again face destruction. Decades after Jesus' crucifixion, tensions between Rome and the Jewish population erupted into open revolt. The Jewish revolt began in AD 66. Roman forces responded. The conflict became catastrophic. Eventually, Jerusalem was surrounded. The siege was devastating, and in AD 70, the Romans captured the city. The Second Temple was destroyed. Once again, Jerusalem burned. Once again, the temple was gone. Once again, the city that had seemed permanent was brought to ruins. And if you remember the question we asked earlier, this is where it comes full circle. Why would God allow Jerusalem to be destroyed again? The answer is not that Jerusalem had become unimportant. Quite the opposite. The biblical story had never taught that the physical city itself was the ultimate goal. The temple had a purpose. The city had a purpose. The sacrifices had a purpose. The promises had a purpose. They pointed beyond themselves. And in Christian theology, the coming of Christ changes the way those things are understood. After AD 70, Jerusalem entered another radically different chapter. The temple was gone. The sacrificial system associated with it was gone. The political landscape changed. Jewish life continued and developed in new directions. Christianity continued to spread. And yet Jerusalem remained powerful in the imagination of both Jews and Christians. For Christians, the city remained inseparable from Jesus. The cross, the resurrection, the empty tomb, the apostles, Pentecost, the earliest church. But the New Testament also begins to point towards something greater. Jerusalem becomes both a historical place and a theological image. This is especially clear when we reach the final chapters of the Bible, because the story that began with a city on a hill does not end with that city remaining exactly as it was. It ends with something far greater. The book of Revelation gives us one of the Bible's most extraordinary images. John sees a new Jerusalem. But notice what is happening. The city comes down from heaven. It is not simply humanity rebuilding the old Jerusalem. It is part of God's final renewal of creation. And this is where the entire story suddenly comes together. At the beginning of our story, Jerusalem was important because David chose it. Then it became important because Solomon built the temple. Then it became the city people longed for during exile. Then it was rebuilt. Then Herod transformed it. Then Jesus entered it. Then Jesus was crucified there. Then he rose. Then the Christian mission began there. Then the temple was destroyed again. And finally, the biblical story points toward a new Jerusalem. Why? Because the ultimate goal was never simply a particular collection of buildings. The ultimate goal was God dwelling with his people. Revelation describes the new Jerusalem in connection with God's presence. And one of the most beautiful statements in that vision is that God himself will dwell with his people. The story has come full circle. Now we can finally return to the question we asked at the beginning. Why this city? Why Jerusalem? The answer is not because Jerusalem was the biggest city. It wasn't. It was not because it was the richest city. It wasn't. It was not because it controlled the greatest empire. It never did. Jerusalem became important because of what happened there within the biblical story. David made it the capital. The ark was brought there. Solomon built the temple. The prophets spoke about it. The people mourned it in exile. The city was rebuilt. The second temple rose. Herod transformed it. Jesus entered it. Jesus taught there. Jesus confronted the temple authorities there. Jesus was crucified there. Jesus rose. The apostles proclaimed the resurrection there. Pentecost happened there. The Christian mission began there. And the Bible eventually points beyond earthly Jerusalem toward the New Jerusalem. That is why Jerusalem matters. Not because the stones themselves are magical. Not because every event in history can be reduced to the city, but because Jerusalem became one of the great geographical anchors of God's redemptive story. And perhaps this is the most important lesson. If you only look at Jerusalem as a political city, its story is difficult to understand. It was conquered too many times, destroyed too many times, controlled by too many empires. Its fortunes rose and fell. But if you look at Jerusalem through the biblical narrative, another pattern emerges. The city becomes a stage for covenant, a stage for worship, a stage for judgment, a stage for restoration, a stage for prophecy, a stage for the ministry of Jesus, a stage for the cross, a stage for the resurrection, a stage for the birth of the Christian mission. and finally, a symbol pointing toward God's ultimate restoration. Jerusalem was never the final destination. It was always pointing beyond itself. That is why the city could be destroyed and still remain central. The temple could fall and the promises could remain. The walls could collapse and the story could continue. The political rulers could change and the biblical significance could remain. Because the meaning of Jerusalem was never ultimately determined by whoever controlled its walls. It was determined by the role the city played in the story of Scripture. So when someone asks, why was Jerusalem so important? There are several answers. Historically, its location, water supply, defensibility, and political position mattered. Politically, David's choice transformed it into the capital of Israel. Religiously, the temple made it the center of Jewish worship. Culturally, it became the heart of Jewish memory and identity. For Christians, it became inseparable from the final days of Jesus, his crucifixion, resurrection, and the beginning of the church's mission. And biblically, it ultimately became part of a much larger promise, a promise that points beyond an ancient city, toward the restoration of creation itself. So perhaps the most surprising thing about Jerusalem is not simply that the Bible keeps bringing us back to this city. It is why. The Bible keeps returning to Jerusalem because again and again, the city becomes the place where God's promises collide with human history. Kings rise, kings fall, temples are built, temples are destroyed, empires conquer, empires disappear. But the story continues, and at the center of that story is Jesus Christ. Imagine that first hill again, the ancient city below you. Stone walls, narrow streets, the temple rising above the city, pilgrims arriving, priests serving, Roman soldiers watching, and somewhere among those streets, Jesus is walking toward the final hours of his earthly ministry. At first glance, Jerusalem looks like just another ancient city, but once you know its story, you see something different. You see David, you see Solomon, you see the temple, you see the prophets, you see the exile, you see the return, you see the crowds welcoming Jesus, you see the cross, you see the empty tomb, you see the apostles preaching, you see the gospel moving outward from the city to the nations, and then at the end of the biblical story, you see another city, a new Jerusalem. A city connected not merely with walls and buildings, but with the presence of God. And suddenly the question changes. It is no longer simply, why Jerusalem? It becomes, what was Jerusalem pointing toward all along? And that may be the deepest answer of all. Jerusalem was never important merely because of where it was. It was important because of what God chose to do there. And within the Christian story, the greatest of those events is the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The city that witnessed his death also became the city from which his resurrection was proclaimed. The city that had known destruction became associated with hope. The city that had seen temples rise and fall became part of a story that ultimately points toward God's presence with his people forever. So the next time you hear the name Jerusalem, don't think only of an ancient city on a map. Think of a city that carried the weight of thousands of years of biblical history. A city where kings ruled, where prophets warned, where pilgrims worshipped, where Jesus taught, where he died, where his followers proclaimed that he had risen, and a city whose story, according to the Bible, ultimately points beyond itself. Jerusalem was never just a city. It was a crossroads between history and promise. And that is why Jerusalem mattered. That is why it still matters. And that is why, thousands of years later, the question remains so fascinating. Why Jerusalem?